Key to Thriving Workplaces. Here with us, we will be presented by our returning presenter, Kashaya Stewart. I'm also your host, Susanna Reyes of Inspira Consulting, and also a psychological safety certified practitioner. And at this time, I would like to hand you over to Kashaya.
Yep. Hello, everyone. 1 second. Let me just switch on to my screen. 1 second. Go over to share my screen. Sorry, is it nice? One moment.
We still have persons joining in, so that's great.
Lucky. Perfect. Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Hi, good night, everyone. Lovely for you all to join me today. I'll be presenting on Psychological Safety Explained, Wired for Safety. So just a bit of introduction about myself. I'll be quick. My name is Kashaya Stewart. I'm a business psychologist and neuroscience researcher. I work at Be Talent by Zircon, which is a management consultancy limited company based in the United Kingdom. So it is currently 11:30 p.m. for me in London time, but I am still here, of course, because it's always great to share information and share the knowledge, especially with those from Trinidad and Tobago, which I think makes up most of the audience today, but a bit more about Zircon as a company. So we are kind of a fast moving and adaptable talent management consultancy, but we do keep research, business psychology, and neuroscience at the forefront. And just a bit about my educational background as well. So, of course, as I said, I'm a business psychologist. I have a background in neuroscience. So, I have a master's of science in neuroscience from King's College London. I also have a master's in occupational and business psychology, a bachelor's of science in psychology. I've also been a research assistant as well as working in the neurophysiology department in Mount Hope. So I have quite an extensive background and I do a lot of research into psychological safety and a lot of the topics that we'll be discussing today. So I wanted to begin by opening up the space, of course, creating a psychologically safe environment for us all to kind of be able to speak up and share ideas. So I want to first pose this question to the group in terms of what happens when safety is absent. So you can pop it in the chat, or if you feel free, you can kind of speak up as well. But just think about it. What happens when safety is absent? It could be physical safety, it could be mental safety, that psychological safety. To you, what happens when safety is absent? Do we have anyone?
We have in the chat. Madness happens.
Madness, yes, definitely.
That's a very succinct way of putting it.
Yes, definitely madness. Any others? Madness. Savannah, what do you think? What do you feel happens?
We have anxiety in the chat.
Anxiety, yeah.
That I think we also have that lack of being able not to speak up. Yes, thank you, Samantha. People not speaking up. There's that uneasiness of not being able to communicate as you would like.
Yeah.
In the chat, we have as well a sense of fear and uncertainty.
Yes, exactly. Fear and uncertainty, definitely fear and uncertainty we could see being brought on there.
There's also mistrust we have. Thank you.
Nice. Any others? Do we have any more?
If we can just get one more in the chat. One more. See?
Any more?
I would say there's a sense of depression.
Yeah, depression, definitely. Oh, Yes, definitely. And I think this next slide may feel a bit, uncomfortable for people, but in terms of really what happens when safety is absent, I felt like this was one of the best examples, and that was in the Boeing crashes that occurred. So there were two Boeing crashes. One of them was Lion Air Flight 610, and that was in October of 2018. And there was also the Ethiopia Airline Flight 302 that happened in March of 2019. And unfortunately, that did kill 346 people. Now, this is a very stark example of, what can happen. And when they went and they researched what actually went on behind the scenes, the company kind of attributed to the faulty software system, and they said that it was the nose of the plane that kept going down because of a sensor problem, and that's what was causing the issue. But then when they started really digging deeper, they found that there was another kind of underlying problem that was going on. And what was happening was that the Boeing engineers and employees started telling reporters and repeatedly saying that they feared the retaliation that was happening internally. They feared that they couldn't speak up. A lot of the engineers said, we actually knew something was wrong. We actually knew that something was happening, but they felt like there was a culture shift. They had new management. There was a new merger. They had these big financial goals and production schedules that needed to take place. And so some employees were completely aware of this plane issue, but they felt uneasy. They felt like they needed to be silenced. And as someone said, they felt that fear. So they didn't feel like they could have challenged anything. They didn't feel like they could have, say anything and speak up. So this is one really big example, as we can see. And then there's more examples within there. I could go on and on, but this example I felt was so stark because Wells Fargo, I don't know if a lot of people know Wells Fargo, but it's an American multinational financial service. It's a very large bank. It's one of the largest banks in the United States, serving over 70 million customers. And they found that what was happening was employees actually started creating millions and millions of unauthorized bank and credit accounts. They started just falsifying information to meet unrealistic sales quotas. So employees really, they felt pressured in those moments because they said there was almost this toxic culture of that fear, that word fear again, where they felt like they couldn't voice their concerns. They felt like they would be fired because people were being fired every time someone didn't meet their goal or they tried to say something, they would be fired. So that really created this extremely toxic environment. And as you can see in one of the pictures on there where it says you're either killing yourself or you're not enough within Wells Fargo. And unfortunately, that seemed to have been true because last year they had that incident. I'm not sure if a lot of you guys saw that, where an employee actually passed away at their desk and no one noticed for days. And that was last year. And that's such a stark kind of metaphor, if you think about it, or example of that emotional and organizational kind of neglect. It's almost symbolic in terms of that breakdown in human connection and empathy, where people are in fear, people are almost looking over their shoulders. They're in this state where they feel like they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to make money. And it's really concerning when we think about how far spread this could get. So we talked about a plane, we talked about a bank, and even in the police system, the justice system, where we're seeing that they also have these quotas, and they also now are being pushed to give people more tickets, arrest more people because they're trying to get these numbers. And for something like the police force to be a high pressure system where there's this culture of fear and discipline, where putting fingers at each other, where there's these biases coming in, and it's almost as if you speak up, then you're biting someone else's hand. So now they can't get money and they're feeling burnt out and they're just arresting people, and it creates such a toxic cycle, such a toxic environment of fear where nobody wants to speak up. Everyone just wants to do their job and get paid, because at the end of the day, they what can you do? So they feel this sense of just, well, whatever happens. So that human connection really gets lost. And if you really think about it, there is such a big cost to fame. There's this big business cost to fame, because you have higher turnovers. Eventually, people just quit. That environment that we spoke about, where you can't speak up, you can't do anything, you just quit. You have legal battles, with Wells Fargo, where people are suing constantly. They're constantly losing money. They're getting billions in fines, and there's this stiflation of innovation. You can't actually think. You can't make any new ideas. And if we look about it in that, the actual cost of it, it's billions of dollars being lost for businesses every single year. Things like the NHS, which is the National Health Service within the United Kingdom, they're losing $2 billion a year for toxic behavior. For mental health, they're also losing, $51 billion a year every time these things happen. And people working in spite of those illnesses, companies are losing money. So you're almost asking yourself, well, why? Why are we in this state where there's an absence of this safety? Why can't we have the safety if these companies are losing money? If it's leading to these catastrophes, why is this not happening? And I think that's really what brought about this question of psychological safety. That's what brought about this idea of psychological safety, because the absence of it, it's really a risk factor. There's this risk of ethical failure and strategic failure going on. So why not speak about this concept of psychological safety? And that's what Dr. Amy Edmondson actually came about and decided. So she is the person that coined the term of psychological safety. She is a Harvard researcher. And what she defined it as is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up and sharing the ideas. So a lot of times when people hear the term psychological safety, they start to think, oh, the song's a bit fluffy. And I've heard people say as well, oh gosh, these people only want to, come up with this new term. What's the new, term that they're going to come up with next? This is the song in like kumbaya stuff. Why? We just want to come and do our job. But that's not really what psychological safety is about. Psychological safety is more along the lines of, let's not avoid the hard conversations, but let's not also just be nice all the time and friendly all the time. But it's about us having those hard conversations, but having them respectfully, having a productive conversation, having the courage to speak up and feeling safe within an environment to speak up, so that we can collaborate better, so that we can learn faster. Sometimes you're asking yourself, one small mistake happened and it turns into this huge thing. When you're asking yourself, if we just had a conversation about it, it would have saved time, it would have saved energy, And it's about really being able to take smart risks, calculated risks, and ask for help, having and bringing in different views, so people could bring in different ideas, so that you bring the human element back into the business, so things are not just robotic, because we can see what happens when things are just robotic. We could see where the lives of people have been lost, where countless people, have been left paralyzed. People have so much bad outcomes happen when there is this breakdown of psychological safety within a company, within a business, and it's so widespread and culturally, embedded in our society to have this environment of psychological unsafety. So it's really about understanding that it's not fluffy, it's not cute, but it's about really opening up the conversation so that we can get to a proper solution in time. And we can see that it actually works. It helps a lot, because companies, teams who have invested in psychological safety, they found that it does relate to higher performance. It's relating to, more engagement, and it's actually saving companies money in the long run. So we can see that psychological safety has such great impacts. And one of the best examples for this that we have is from Google. So Google actually launched a project. They called it Project Aristotle. So they were trying to uncover what was the secret. They were trying to figure out what was the secret sauce in terms of creating these high performing, wonderful teams. So they were really looking to identify what was the it factor, what separates the average team from one that just excels as a great, wonderful team. And they actually analyzed hundreds of teams, and they looked at so much different information. They looked at the skill level. They were looking at the diversity of the team. They were looking at even where you sat at lunch, your lunch habits, what was your tenure, your educational status. They were looking at so many different factors. And I hope someone could guess what was the number one thing that came out. And if you guess psychological safety, you would be correct, because psychological safety came up as the number one key, the outperformer out of everything else in terms of teams. This is what made teams the best, because these teams that had psychological safety, they were more productive. They completed their projects, they completed it faster and with fewer errors. They were more innovative. 31% more innovative. So these teams, they were more likely to propose new ideas and actually implement those ideas and get to the final stages. They also had these lower turnover rates. So, they were less likely to leave the team. They felt like they liked this team, so they wanted to stay there. And because they wanted to stay, they were more engaged. So, they felt like they had better morale. They felt better satisfaction within the team. So we could see that just tangible outcomes, how well psychological safety actually does within a team. But the question is why? Why does psychological safety actually help? Now, I know practically we could think about it, of course, if you're in more of a safe environment, you could speak up more, you have working with people that you actually enjoy working with, why it could actually give you a better outcome. But what does the brain actually tell us about psychological safety? So on the screen now, you can see that I have 3 brains up on there. We have the threat brain, the drive brain, and the safe brain. So let's start off with that threat brain at the side there, because seeing how the brain works is really interesting, because when the brain actually really decides, the brain, how the brain feels determines actually how we function. A lot of people try to trick the brain or hack the brain, but after a while, the brain knows how it functions, and we could hack it to a certain extent, but over time, the brain will tell us what's going on. So if we look at the brain under threat, when we feel that threat brain, when we're perceiving danger, whether it be physical, emotional, and social, what happens to the brain is that it goes into survival mode. As we say, that psychological unsafety, people just, say, well, I'm just trying to make ends meet at the end of the day. And that's us really just going into survival mode. We go into this fight, flight, or freeze response, because what the brain is trying to do is trying to save itself. It's trying to protect itself, because it's seeing the workplace, it's seeing, your boss, your colleagues, meetings, notes, presentations as predators. It's looking at the world in that way. And if we look at it this way, if we look at the threat brain side, what's actually happening is there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And it's like a little almond-sized shape in the brain, but the amygdala does a lot, because what it is, it's our threat detection system. So it's constantly scanning, and it's constantly thinking about our memories and looking for threats around. And of course, if we think about hunter gatherers, that type of thing, we needed that threat system to know what's going on when there's a natural disaster happening. I heard that there was an earthquake earlier today in Trinidad, and that's when you start to hear that sound, that rattling noise, and the brain starts kicking in, you almost feel like your hair standing up and you're acutely aware of what's going on. That's your amygdala actually taking over. But what tends to happen when you're in that threat brain is that the amygdala hijacks the entire system because your cortisol, which is the stress hormone, that actually spikes. So you just start that hormone, that stress hormone starts flooding the system. And what the body does is it starts taking resources, it starts taking blood, it starts taking oxygen away from other parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, which is our logical reasoning, critically analyzing part of the brain, and it down regulates it. So it goes down the totem pole and it's saying, okay, you might need to run, you might need to, find safety. So let's take stuff away from that part of the brain and pump it into your muscles so that you could run or you could fight that bear if you need to. And really start tunnel visioning, you're looking for immediate danger. But then what happens? You can no longer create, you can no longer feel, innovative. You can't actually think strategically because that prefrontal cortex, it starts dimming, you're now becoming more risk avoidant, you're defensive, you're reactive because you're now in this just a state of survival. So you can no longer collaborate, you can't learn, you can't actually move forward. So if you think about the threat brain, it makes so much sense why that occurs. But it also, it's not a great place to be because staying in that threat brain, the heart is constantly going, it's constantly pumping. That's what leads to things like strokes, heart attacks, all these things that happen because we can't stay in that threat brain for too long because you can't sleep, you can't do anything. The body starts learning that you are under constant threat. The amygdala starts growing actually in the brain. Other parts of the brain start shrinking and we start pumping more resources into the amygdala. And that's how you turn into someone who's constantly angry, constantly anxious, constantly stressed. So we can't stay within that threat brain at all. That's not a great place to be. But we also have the part of the brain, the blue side over there, which I like to call the safe part of the brain, That's
Kashaya, just a quick
yeah.
Just to interject there.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that threat brain. If you can go back to this slide.
Yep, sure thing. This one?
Yes, the threat slide of the arrow, where
Oh, yes, this one.
those 6 steps that you shared, coming from the space of in any workspace environment, regardless of who you have in your span of control, would you say that you could actually visually see some of these steps taking place on the job site for employees where there's a brain threat?
Yes, it could be. It's honestly, it gets so fascinating because sometimes if you think about right before you have to speak or you see someone having to go on stage, right before they go on stage, sometimes you could see their eyes widening or you see them start sweating and their paws, your hands start getting clammy and you see people start, fidgeting and seeming anxious right before a big presentation. And you could almost see where you're talking to them and, you feel like their eyes are glazing over and you're asking them questions and they're like, I can't even remember what I'm about to say. They can't remember what they're supposed to be doing, anything like that. And it's so quick to see. It's almost like, as you said, you could see those steps happening where the person is glazing over, the amygdala is taking over, they're going into fight or flight in front of your eyes. And then you're like, okay, that's when you start having to pull them out of that threat brain.
Yes. And understanding, at least for me, I could now understand the correct terms, like you said, in cortisol spikes.
Yes. And it's so easy.
Any comments within the chat? I mean, I just thought I wanted to share that because it could I've seen it, so I could associate with it. If anybody in the chat experienced that would be great. So I know it's not just me alone. You would see it in your own space.
Yes, definitely. I could even say I felt it. If you think about just sometimes a Teams call, or you hear a Teams call, or you hear your phone ringing, or your boss sends you a message, let's have a chat, even something like that. All of a sudden, you could feel your heart going in your chest.
Yes. Thank you. Go ahead.
Definitely. Okay.
We have, yes, of course. Good, from Samantha. Thanks, Samantha. It's on to Safe Brain. Let's go.
Yes. Nice. So the safe brain. This one feels more calm. It's nice and blue. And on this side, this is where you kind of feel calm. This is the openness and the connectedness. And this is the state where, you could feel fully human, where you have that complex thinking, but you're still in a state of reflection. So on the blue side now, on that arrow going up, we could see that when the safe side of the brain is activated, the prefrontal cortex is fully activated. And as we said, that prefrontal cortex is that kind of high level thinking, that critical analysis that's going on. But it's also where the planning is going on, the reflection, your ability to think abstractly. And when you have that space to think, you get so much great ideas. And there's another part of the brain that I didn't put on there, but it's called the default mode network, and that's where rumination happens. So that's where you have space to think. Now when the amygdala hijacks the brain, the default mode network can't operate. It's completely shut down. It goes down. So you're almost ruminating about the wrong things. So when you're in this more safe brain, the prefrontal cortex is going, the default mode network is going, you're ruminating, you're having these oh my gosh, ideas where your dopamine is rising. So, we have this reward system going up. We feel great. The oxytocin as well is increasing, and that's a hormone associated with trust and connection. So remember in that team that Google talked about where they said that they felt like they wanted to stay in that team, that trust that they build with each other, that's that oxytocin level rising, and they feel open to learning. They feel open to feedback because they trust each other and they feel safe within each other to be able to speak up. So they can share creatively, they can be strategic, they could collaborate with each other, and they feel, much more regulated. So that's really the safe brain is where we want to be, because that's the state where innovation, empathy, and high performance could really thrive within the brain. So yeah, we love the safe side of the brain that's there. And now the other part of the brain that we could see there, the thrive brain. So a lot of times when we show people, we talk about the thrive brain, a lot of people like that part of the brain, because you see there's words like compete, achieve, experiment, accumulate. That's the part of the brain that's going, this isn't in the fair response, but it's not fully at rest either. It's really that energized, you're focused, you're really hungry for progress. You're in pursuit. You're going, you're ready to go. You want to achieve, you want to solve that problem, you want to experiment, you want to progress. There's momentum in there. So a lot of people like that thrive part of the brain, but it can't really stay in that part of the brain. And I'll explain why. Because in that part of the brain, dopamine is actually the key driver. So remember, in the threat brain, it was the amygdala. In the safe brain, the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine is in charge here in terms of the thriving brain, right? And that's, as we say, the reward circuit. You feel great when you get those rewards and you still want to go. And there's other parts of the brain as well. So there's the nucleus accumbens, and that's part of the reward circuit as well. That's also being lit up when we expect achievements and recognition of success. There's also noradrenaline, and noradrenaline also comes up if you think about the fight, flight, or freeze response. That also sharpens our attention and our alertness, and it's great in the short term because we need those, bounce of adrenaline to have us going, to have us especially, checking our surroundings, but it can be draining, of course, if prolonged. And the prefrontal cortex is a part of the drive brain, but it's only partially activated, when we're thinking strategically and stuff like that. That's where the prefrontal cortex is involved. But just thinking about the things I'm saying, dopamine, rewards, adrenaline, partially the prefrontal cortex, we could kind of already start to formulate in our mind how being a drive brain too long, too performance oriented, too, go could lead us directly into the threat brain. Because a lot of times what seems to happen, and I know we have this thing that we like to say where the path to hell is paved with good intentions, where a lot of companies that come to us like the Thrive Brain. They like how the Thrive Brain sounds because that sounds like profit. That sounds like the goal, right? To get to the Thrive Brain. But what happens is they start leading the employees directly to the Threat Brain because they get too performance oriented. They get too focused on getting to the goal without reflection, right? Is compete at all costs, get to the goal at all costs without the actual reflection. And unfortunately, when we get into that mode, then think about it, the actual people that are trying to reflect, the actual people who want to, come up with other ideas, they start going down into the background. And now the loudest, the most confident, those people start pushing because they're ready to go. They're going forward. When somebody saying, I don't know about the idea, that's not moving forward. That's taking us backwards, right? So they're thinking, no, we want these people up in front. We want these people up and, front and center. But unfortunately, that could lead us to the wrong place. And this code could be a bit problematic sometimes. Some people don't like this code while other people really like it. When they talk about the problem with the world is that the intelligent people are full of doubt, while the stupid ones are full of confidence. Now, I wouldn't want to say the stupid ones. Sometimes it could be the uninformed ones. But if we really think about this quote and what we said before in terms of that threat brain and, the loudest person going up, going forward, we could actually see this play out a lot of times in real life when we go into a space and, you have good ideas, but there's someone else who could talk louder than you. So you're just like, okay, well, let's just let them take over. I might have an idea, but they sound like they know what they're talking about. So I just going to let them go and speak. And quite frankly, this quote as well, sometimes if you do some reflection, you could also come up being the one that someone else might say is the one talking full confidence, going with an idea, while you're kind of, not letting someone else go. You're actually overpowering their opinion. And now someone else is now full of doubt unintentionally. And this could be really dangerous in the workplace, as you could imagine, dangerous in the boardroom when there's one person shouting and everybody else, just like in Boeing, is now too afraid to speak. Now the CEO is speaking, you can't speak. You don't want to bring in your idea. You don't want to, rock the boat. You don't want to change the status quo. And unfortunately, what this can do is lead a whole company, a whole group of people into this idea of groupthink, this idea of blindly following what someone else says just because, and this group thing could really lead us into not a great place, which is why a lot of times we push people to have this cognitive diversity, because what we want to do is put these different people in a room, put people with different ideas, put all these different intelligent people that come from different places with different ideals to come together and share their opinion, which is why we like to talk about this thing called cognitive diversity, which, as I said, just means understanding how we're bringing together people with different perspectives, different mental models, even people who think differently from us, make decisions differently from us. Are they more of a risk taker in terms of decisions? Are they more articulate? These types of things all come together because people bring their life experiences, they challenge assumptions, and they stop us from now and protect us from just becoming this intellectual echo chamber where we have this group think, everybody has the same idea, and it just ends up turning into a complete fail. Because sometimes you ever felt like you're sat in a room where all these smart people are talking, but it's just like you're asking yourself, well, I don't think that plan will probably work, because these people not seeing it from the point of view that you're seeing it at. But you're too afraid to speak up. And the problem about it is cognitive diversity helps groupthink, helps us from going into this echo chamber. But the having diverse ideas, having diversity in thought only adds value when there is a psychologically safe environment. You have to have that psychologically safe environment for cognitive diversity to occur. So, It has to have that cognitive diversity by psychological safety in order to get those better decisions, in order for us, as we saw before, to prevent fewer disasters from occurring. Because, as I said, that psychological safety leads us straight into this copy paste zombies. Everybody just, you see sometimes university students, they come in, bright ideas. It's almost like, yes, they want to change the world. They have these great ambitions and they think, I have this grand idea. And they join a company and you look at them a month later, 2 months later, a year later, and it's almost like they've grayed their eyes, you're seeing like all their hopes and dreams just gone because they've almost been indoctrinating it into this kind of society, indoctrinating into this copy and paste, and we call this functional stupidity. We do. It's a bit of a harsh term, like the other quote, but it's really about when intelligent professionals, they know something is wrong, they know this isn't working as it should be, but they're not saying anything because it's simply easier to comply. It's easier to, like Boeing, it's easier to just ignore those safety flaws. It's easier for Wells Fargo to just do for all, they just say, just be, just be there. Just money need to make at the end of the day. Just be a mindless zombie, avoid friction, avoid rocking your boat to just get things done. And sometimes, from the outside looking in, especially, within the space of business psychology, sometimes we get a lot of people asking like, well, why it is that people become these mindless zombies? We know the brain doesn't like it. We know that people feel uncomfortable, but so why does this keep being perpetuated? And the thing about it is the brain is also involved in that as well, because a lot of times social pain feels like physical pain. Within the brain, the same areas, the anterior cingulate cortex, that's a part of the brain where we actually process physical discomfort, and the insula as well. That's the next part of the brain that also lights up when we feel pain. That also lights up when we feel excluded. That lights up when we feel like, we shaking the boat, we going against the grain a little bit. Something, when you're sitting down in the break room and nobody wants to sit down next to you, or you come up with that idea and people, look at you a little funny. That feels like physical pain for people. And there was this really interesting study that they did where they actually gave participants Tylenol, and they looked at physical pain before that. Physical pain, they looked at emotional pain, and they found that the brain, after brain scans, that the social pain actually dulled as well as physical pain after the Tylenol. So participants weren't told whether they got Tylenol or not, but it actually dulled that pain for them. So that's why a lot of people go with the green. That's why a lot of people just stick to the status quo, because it doesn't feel nice to rock the boat. It doesn't feel nice to be the one that has to, stand out and make that change and make that difference. So I guess you're probably asking yourself then what can I do then? We talk about the physical pain, we talk about the brain. Then what can I do as someone who just, is in a team, or am I a manager, leader, or entrepreneur that's, trying to build their own company? How then can I shape psychological safety? How can I fix this thing if there's so many elements involved? But it really comes down to this intentional behavior from yourself. Really, if we think about it, it's for us to try and shift the culture little by little to make that change. So if we look at it from kind of the individual level of creating psychological safety, then it's really about being aware of your reactions. It's really about looking around to see what's going on. So do you shut people down, or do you invite people in? So sometimes it could be a simple thing as somebody asks you, Kushaya, that presentation you did, about that page, and you started, but what about that page? Do you start shutting them down, or do you open up the conversation oh, okay, yes, what about that page? Would you, do you have some feedback for me? All those type of things. So it's really sometimes being aware of how you react in some situations. And sometimes it's about admitting that you don't know. So in these culture of psychological unsafety, a lot of times people are afraid to even mention the fact that they don't know, afraid to say, I simply don't understand. And a lot of times you could even phrase it in different ways. So a lot of people don't like to say I don't know, but maybe you could say, I'm not too sure about that topic. I could probably do the research to find it, or this other person that's involved in this project knows it a bit better than me. Let's check with them, and if not, I could do external research to get to the answer that you're trying to get. So sometimes it's really about how as an individual you could change just these little things to really, start mirroring that psychological safety, and also modeling curiosity instead of criticism. And that's really trying to figure out why something happened, or why something occurred, or what's going on. So really asking more of the question of why, instead of pointing fingers or saying that thing wasn't right. Well, why didn't that work? Maybe we could dig a little deeper to find the actual answer, instead of going into that was done incorrectly. Why is it like that? So more of changing and modeling our ideals around it. But from like a managerial position, or even as a leader, what we've seen work quite well is making it safe to speak up, even if it's bad news. So for example, I could give an example for myself. Was when I first joined the company that I'm in, we do a lot of things online. And what happened was one person came in, and they needed me to send a report for someone, a personal report. And I sent it to them via email. Now, we're not supposed to send information via email, but it was a bit of when I was newer to the company. So I just sent it via email, and then someone else on the team, and I CC'd everyone in it, because I said, okay, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. So I just CC'd everyone in it. And then someone else on the team told me, okay, you're not supposed to actually send these details by email. And then I said, oh, okay. And I brought it up in my manager one-to-one call, and she kind of went through the steps with me. Okay, asked why I sent it that way. And I said, well, I saw someone else sent the details like that. And she explained that when it was sent like that, it was password protected. So it's almost like the space was created for me to admit that I made a mistake. I was okay not to speak up and say, I actually did send this thing that I'm not supposed to send like that. But we went through the steps of getting there and making sure that it's done. And as you can see, that saves so much time, instead of it being an argument and a point fingers, who did this and did that, and a screaming match. It goes so much more smoothly when, as a manager, you could open up that space where someone could say, I did this thing wrong. This is why. Let's move forward. And even celebrating learning and not just outcomes. So not just celebrating the output, but really, okay, as a team, we actually got this thing done. We've learned this new skill. We've done this new thing. Really celebrating the journey, and not just, toil through the whole project and only hooray when we get to the end. Let's celebrate. Okay, we've gone through this hurdle together. Wonderful. Let's keep going. That type of thing. And also creating a space, creating these rituals. When I say rituals, it's almost like having, after project, lessons learned, weekly check-ins, that type of thing, a improvement tracker, all these things as a manager, these little things that you could sprinkle within to kind of just create this understanding of, let's create something that feels psychologically safe for my team within the company, that promotes reflection. And it doesn't even have to be in-person reflection. It could be anonymous reflection. It could be, whether you have little team sessions where you get them to give feedback anonymously, all these things to just really try starting to chip away and create something that feels psychologically safe for the team to help move that along. And then also too, for an entrepreneur or someone, you're trying to found a company, there are also ways that you could also create psychological safety, like building these systems within your company, building and rewarding this kind of transparency, and rewarding people coming up with new ideas, or even just hiring people that think differently from you. A lot of times we see a lot of people hiring the same type of people. We see companies where they're full of people that are, very reflective, very calculated. They, They could go through and read through things all the time. They're detail oriented, but they don't take risks. They don't actually make decisions. So we have a bunch of thinkers, no action doers. So sometimes you really have to find people that are going to challenge you, are going to push you, especially if you're, new to your business. And also talking about safety explicitly, making it known that this is what you stand for. You stand for psychological safety, and hoping that that brings people towards you as well. And I love this model. I know in terms of time, there's not too much time, but I love this SCARF model because what the SCARF model by David Rock, he created this model. And for him, he said he felt like these 5 social needs, what they do is this is what shapes human behavior in the workplace. So he found that these 5, they almost like needs. So when they're threatened, they activate either your threat brain or your safe brain. So I like this model because you can almost scan through and really feel like what relates to you, what actually, triggers you in a way. So is it status? Is it that for status you need to feel important or you need to feel respected within a space? If that gets threatened, if you feel a bit ignored or if you feel undervalued, does that really, trigger you in a way? Or is it certainty? Do you need to know what's going on in the business? Do you need to know, predict the future? Like if things keep changing in an organization, does that make you feel like, oh no, that doesn't feel great for me, I need that stability? Or is it autonomy? Do you have to feel, control over your choices? If your company has one of those softwares where it tracks every move you make on a computer, is that something that you really hate? Because then autonomy might be something that really triggers you. Or is it relatedness? Do you need to feel a sense of belonging, of sense of connection? Or is it fairness? Do you need to feel that kind of fairness, that treatment? Things can't be biased, so they can't have a double standards within a workplace. And I really like this model because this helps you actually reflect on yourself. For you, what feels like a slight, what would actually at work, trigger you. And I think we do have enough time to kind of go through if there's anyone who feels safe to put it in the comments about this model, what actually jumped out to them. It could be 1 or 2, just maybe what actually jumped out to you in terms of the SCARF model. What do you relate to? I know for me, it's definitely things like fairness or, autonomy. I don't really like to feel like I'm being watched over my shoulder too much, because then I start, feeling a bit like, oh no, am I going to make a mistake? And then I make mistakes. So, Susanna, was there anyone in the comments that?
In the comments, no, there's no comments thus far. I too like this model as well, so I can speak for myself too. I'm all for certainty and fairness as well.
Definitely. Okay, and was there anyone else that had kind of any thoughts? Any one of these that jumped out? No one else? Okay, no problem.
Today.
Oh, pardon, sorry?
I said it's a quiet bunch today. There's no questions yet.
Okay, no worries. And that takes us nicely into bridging the cultural gap. Now, I've spoken a lot before about psychological safety. We've gone through this model. I gave you some examples of, things that you may be able to do. But in terms of the cultural gap, because we know, especially the Caribbean, we know that there's a culture around us, and speaking up could feel very risky because culture plays a huge role in how psychological safety actually shows up. And it's very complex. If we think about Caribbean society, if we think about how we were raised, things like, authorities, speaking up, some of these things could be seen as disrespectful. If you're new to a company, it's almost, that hierarchical system going on, or these kind of emotions happening. So, we do have these feelings of, oh no, there's this culture around us, and it could be harder for us to kind of create, open up, and reflect. But the truth of the matter is that, psychological safety we need to do better, basically, in terms of it. We need to kind of fight through, because we know what happens when psychological safety isn't there. We know that you can't innovate. We know that we can't grow. There's no growth in fear. We can't thrive without that trust within a team. And as we say, it's not about avoiding these hard conversations, but it's really about trying to create better conversations, create a conversation that's actually doing what it's supposed to do and actually helping us to progress. So I think that leads me very nicely into my last slide. So this is about kind of what would you do to rewire, because it's not about changing an HR policy, rewriting all the values on the wall, but it's really about starting with yourself as a human, one person. So one person deciding to listen instead of reacting. It's about one person asking each other, what do you think? Asking someone else, shit, what do you feel in this moment? What's your opinion on this matter? Or one person choosing courage over silence. So I guess some of these questions I pose to you is, what would you do? What would you rewire? Will you listen more openly? Do you feel like you can speak up more courageously, or invite more perspectives, or even apologize more quickly to kind of create this psychologically safe space? And that one person, of course, can be you, it can be myself, because these cultural changes, they don't change when they change. It doesn't change when that person over there change, or that organization over there change, but it changes when we change, when we push together to try and get to these ends. So yeah, that takes me nicely to the end of my presentation. Lovely.
Thank you so much, Kashaya. We do have a question. How do we get companies to care about or invest in psychological safety? That's a good question.
Yeah. Nice question. I think what we've seen a lot of times is bringing some of those statistics, especially in the beginning, where we talk about, how much it costs companies, because what we've seen actually is a lot of leaders around the world, not much in the Caribbean that I've seen, actually say that they would like to invest in psychological safety. They want to put their money into psychological safety, because when we bring the stats to them, when they see how much billions that they're losing, when they see that their teams aren't functioning, when we actually, when they do their engagement surveys and they're seeing like such low numbers. We've seen so many times where a company comes to us and they're like, we can't actually make decisions, and we have this huge project that we have to do, and we give them a psychological safety assessment, and then the team is like, well, we can't actually make decisions. No one wants to make a decision. No one wants to speak up. And it's so incredibly low. When we bring that evidence to them, that's when they're like, okay, this is actually something that we need to invest in. So I think going to companies with the stats, going with the evidence, going with how much money, unfortunately, a lot of companies care mostly about the dollars and cents. That's when they start listening. And when we show them how much teams are actually doing well, when we say Google is investing in these things, some of these large organizations that we work with so many organizations, and they absolutely love psychological safety, and some of them fully embedded into their system. We have large luxury brands, we have banks within the United Kingdom, we have all these other companies that are pouring money into psychological safety, because when they start doing these assessments, they're actually seeing that their teams are doing better, their teams are working better. And so when they start seeing that, that's when they're picking up, and it's like a full embedded system into their company.
Right. I have another question. Can psychological safety exist in high pressure or competitive environments? Because there is the misconception that performance and pressure are incompatible with safety.
Yeah, I think definitely, that's definitely a hard one. If we look at kind of like the brain, when we say there's like the thrive brain, the threat brain, and the safe brain. So being in that kind of really competitive space, it really leads you into kind of just that, thriving brain instead of a safe brain. So I would say it's not impossible, but it's definitely difficult, because what we've seen with companies like that, where externally it's very competitive, what we see is that teams now try to turn within each other, where they may feel psychological safety within their team, but not really in the wider environment, right? So what we see is teams starting to kind of create bubbles or spaces of psychological safety. So it's like high pressure, they're going and going and going, but within their team, they're trying to make it where people could speak up and share ideas, where people can actually say, okay, this thing isn't working. Because yeah, as you say, it's very hard to have that, deadline, next thing, what can we do? And then also be psychologically safe. So it's almost like you find yourself a bit more into the thriving brain, but you can still within your team try to create this space where it doesn't feel like as much pressure. It's almost like a slight shield of psychological safety, just a little shield of psychological safety where, it could kind of hopefully buffer the effects of it, of that. Yeah. But it's definitely difficult. You would want to try and, I guess, get the climate to change, but it's more of making sure that your culture within your team, I guess, feels psychologically safe in that environment.
And I know we would have captured, some high points as to the signs in the workplace, but, from your experience and all of your research, what would be, I think, the top signs that, as you had mentioned, we as, individuals or leaders or partners or entrepreneurs, that would be signs that lacks psychological safety? At least, the top things, the top warning signs, silence during meetings. But in your mind, what would be those top 3 things from your research?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, you hit the nail on the head when you said silent during meetings, is that a lot of people start zoning out. You start seeing like disengagement is what we like to call it. And a lot of people, there was a huge thing on the news where people were talking about quiet quitting, because that's exactly what that is, where people start getting disengaged. They're like, well, I'm not going to, I'm not going to fight, I'm not going to do anything, And so they really kind of, as you say, glaze over, and then they disengage, and then they leave. In terms of, I think, other things within psychologically unsafe environments, I think a lot of times it's like if you see anger, kind of, a lot of misunderstandings going on, it almost feels very toxic, where there's always an argument. We've seen it in companies, especially when I speak to people from, like, the Caribbean or Trinidad, where they say, someone has an opinion in a boardroom and it turns into a screaming match. People are cursing, people are calling each other all these different names within the workplace. That's a clear sign that something is wrong, because it shouldn't be like that. This is a workplace. There shouldn't be these kind of big outbursts of anger and stuff like that. It's more supposed to be like, focused onto how we can actually change. And I think the other thing is in terms of a lot of times just overall well-being, or people like getting sick all the time. Do people, are they not showing up to work? Are they absent? They, all these things tend to happen. People tend to really get sick when they're in these psychologically unsafe environments, because they're constantly under pressure, they're constantly stressed. Most times, if a company isn't really putting much into their well-being, a lot of other things start falling through the cracks. So if we see well-being low, then we tend to check for psychological safety as well, because we're like, okay, something isn't doing too well in terms of that. So as I said, it would be well-being, it would be, these kind of big emotional outbursts, big problems going on, and also kind of that disengagement and silence.
So thank you so much. There are no more questions I'm seeing thus far. It's now 7:29 over here, Kashaya.
Yes.
Unless there are anybody on this meeting would like to ask a question or comment, because this has certainly been a very informative session. Please feel free, because we are working with strictly the time, knowing Kashaya has to sleep.
Yes.
Anyone? All right. So there are no other questions. So Kashaya, again, on behalf of Inspira Consulting, I would certainly like to say thank you so much for this presentation. For persons on the call, also, I forgot to mention, it's being recorded where the entire session would be uploaded onto the website. That's at www.inspiraltd.com. That could be shared with persons who were not able to make, but I know for sure they're looking forward to understanding psychological safety. And of course, feel free, you can reach out if there are any questions. Thank you so much. I'm seeing in the chat, very informative session. That's our aim. If there are any questions or comments before we close. Excellent session, very impactful, a lot to take away. Thanks to both of you. Thanks, Jiz. All right. So everyone have a safe night, and we look forward to productive week ahead. Thanks again so much, guys.
Thank you.